Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Talking Tours. We'll just wait a moment while everyone joins in with us, and then we'll commence the session with our usual acknowledgement of country. My name is Mark Laylor, and I'm the Senior Product Manager here at Limelight Arts Travel, and I'm joined today by Dr. Kathleen Olive, whom I'm sure you all know very well. So to start us off, in the spirit of reconciliation, Limelight Arts Travel acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So just an introduction of Kathleen for those of you who may not know. She's one of our beloved tour leaders and a director with Limelight Arts Travel, along with Nick Gordon. She's been leading cultural tours for more than 15 years with a particular focus on Italy and Western Europe. In recent years, Kathleen's developed a deep interest in Japan's design aesthetic, arts and craft, history and culture that's seen her lead an ever-expanding repertoire of tours to Japan. And coming up later in the year, she's leading our inaugural, although we have one that's just going just before Kathleen's tour in November, exploring Kyushu. So welcome, Kathleen, and thanks for talking to us about the Exploring Kyushu tour today.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be in the same time and space as you for once. And for people who may not have met you before, you design and plan our tours to Japan as someone who lived and worked there and studied the language and culture extensively. So yes, we get to work together on a lot of these tours.
And ironically, I've seen more of Japan since doing this than I did when I lived there. So to start us off, as I mentioned in the introduction, your background's Italy, but you've developed a lot for Japan. And I can see that there are some cultural similarities between the two countries. What is it that interests you about Japan? What got you on board with Japan as a country?
For me, I think it was probably the fashion. So in the 1990s, in particular is when I first kind of consciously started looking at fashion and following fashion. And it was the kind of forward-looking and innovation of Japanese fashion designers like Rei Kawakubo at Comme des Garçons, or Issey Miyake, for example, and in Australia, of course, Akira Sakawa. So I think that was probably the first thing that got on my radar was the innovation of Japanese fashion, but it also seemed obvious even to someone like me that Japanese fashion was simultaneously rooted in a long tradition. So you don't have to look very long, I think, at an Issey Miyake garment before you start thinking about origami. So I think probably it was fashion was the way in. And then I started leading tours to Japan, which again, you had a hand in helping to design about almost 10 years ago now. First started taking groups to Japan. And it is a place where the more I've learned about its history and culture, I just become more and more fascinated by it as a culture.
And it's an interesting country because it's quite spread out and diverse. It's each sort of island or area, there are different regions and then different prefectures throughout. And you've been through quite a few of them now, so you'd notice that, especially the difference between the north and the south. And this tour in particular, that's basically circumnavigating Kyushu. So what's different about the Kyushu region that you've
Yeah. I'll just share before I forget, just for the time being, I'll just share a map of Kyushu and its relationship to Japan. And we won't keep it up for the full chat, but just so that people can get a sense. This map is actually really handy because it does outline most of the, in fact, all of the destinations really on the Kyushu tour. So it's quite a handy one. I think that is your first question about from the interest in Italy, why the interest in Japan. This is something that I really see in common between the two countries, and that is regional variance and how much, sadly, I don't speak Japanese, but even with respect to the language, it's clear to me that language and accents change across the country, and also history and the type of artifacts that are produced, and particularly in the case of Italy and Japan cuisine as well. So
Yeah.
Kyushu, as you can see on the inset map on the right, is in a sense the southernmost main island in the archipelago, because what's not on that inset map at right is the Ryukyu Islands, or Okinawa, the Okinawa group that doesn't kind of fit on the map. It's south again of Kyushu. But Kyushu is quite a large island, as I think people can see from it in relationship to Honshu, the main kind of island in Japan, and then Shikoku, which you can see from some parts of Kyushu. You can see Shikoku from Beppu and Oita, for example. It's a large island. It's really defined by its geography, which I suppose most of Japan is, to be fair, mountains and volcanoes in particular. Lots and lots of smaller, far-flung islands kind of encircling Kyushu. Every time Japan is geo-mapped, they find more islands than the last time they had a look. So kind of permanently growing collection of islands. And it just has a really fascinating history, because if people can see on that inset map, it's kind of the stepping stone to the mainland of Asia, so through South Korea, the peninsula of South Korea, and onto China as well. And it is thought that it's through that part of the southern archipelago that people first arrived in Japan by crossing a land bridge that is no longer in existence between Korea and probably the area of Kyushu, so probably Fukuoka-ish, we think. And it just maintained that historic role over time of being a gateway to the mainland. So that gives it quite a different history and culture to the rest of Japan. And this is something that together you and I have tried to kind of map in the tour itinerary.
Yeah, and that maritime gateway also plays an important role in Kyushu's history, going back to the original culture and through feudal times, and its relationship to outside countries. As you say, it's sort of been a stepping stone, not only within to Japan itself, but within the regions of that Southeast Asia area. What's that sort of relationship about?
It really starts around Fukuoka, if people can see that in the north of the island on the larger map that's on the screen. And Fukuoka, which for a lot of its history was known as Hakata, was from the 8th century. It was where Japan centered its international diplomatic relations. So in the 8th century, the imperial dynasty founds a new capital, Heian-kyo, which we call Kyoto. And when they're dealing in this kind of cyclical relationship diplomatically, there's always a push-pull with Korea and China in terms of how Japan relates to them over its history. When it's in the kind of positive part of the cycle, those relationships are governed by ambassadors and bureaucrats who are based in Hakata or Fukuoka. So it's from the 8th century that it becomes this base for international relations. And then people are probably more familiar with the later part of that story, which is centered around Nagasaki, which you can see in the southwest of the island of Kyushu map. That's the larger map on the screen. And Nagasaki was the only kind of licit place for international communities to live after the early 17th century in Japan. And even those international communities, as people will know, were really, really circumscribed. We're talking just about the Dutch and just about the Chinese. And they were allowed to live in two gated communities in Nagasaki, and occasionally allowed to interact with the shoguns in Kyoto and Tokyo, or Edo as it was known then. So those two cities in particular, Fukuoka, which was then known as Hakata, and Nagasaki, really those international gateways. So in a sense, our tour starts and finishes with them. We start in Fukuoka and we kind of go clockwise around the island, and the last big chunk of the tour is spent in Nagasaki, and then we just go up to Fukuoka to kind of close the tour because it's a convenient place to leave from.
Yeah, so it's basically a full circumnavigation, except for the extreme southern parts, and we miss out on Kagoshima, unfortunately. The tour that reflects all of Kyushu's diversity, really, doesn't it?
It does. And something, because as you know, I've just got back from a kind of a lightning fast trip to Kyushu to meet with some people before the tours that we have that are leaving. My tour is in November, and then we've got, as you said, a second departure, which actually leaves earlier
Yeah.
in October with Rel Mott, who's a Japan specialist, and her tour does still have places available on it. And so when I made this lightning trip to Kyushu about 10 days ago, it really impressed on me that the way the tour is structured kind of spends a chunk of time in that circumnavigation of the island. The chunks of time we spend in each place are kind of telling different aspects of the Kyushu story. So Fukuoka, I think, really is the gateway kind of place. We do literally start and finish the tour at the gateway, so that makes sense. And then we come around clockwise where there's the marker Oita on the map. We stay in that big bay, which I think you can see from the topographical map is formed by volcanic action. So we stay in a place called Beppu, which is famous as a kind of a hot spring town thanks to those volcanoes. Then we curve around through heading southwest from Oita to Kumamoto, which for us is principally a jumping off place to the quite far-flung Amakusa Islands, which people can see continuing that curve kind of southwest of Yatsushiro. You can see Amakusa Island, and that's the location for the UNESCO listed hidden Christian sites. So that's why we're visiting there. And then we get a boat over from there to Nagasaki. And in Nagasaki, we really focus on that kind of period of international trade and how that affected particularly Japan's kind of material or craft culture. And obviously we also think there about World War II and the effects of that on Nagasaki. And then we close the tour by going up through where Saga is mapped on the screen there. That Saga city is a capital of Saga Prefecture, and we spend time there in order to visit the pottery towns that grew up around kind of twin cities of Arita and its port Imari, which are two types of pottery that people who love Japanese ceramics will know, Arita ware and Imari ware. And then from there, we close the loop in Fukuoka. So each place is really telling quite a different story of that Kyushu story, the Kyushu history and culture. And that's something that I'm really looking forward to exploring with people.
Well, let's look a bit more deeply into Fukuoka itself then, since that's where we start and end. So
Sure.
what can we expect from Fukuoka? What's its importance? You've mentioned it as a maritime gateway, but there are other major sites that sort of formulate what really distills Fukuoka as a great city.
Fukuoka is a really modern city, and I think that's something that for people who haven't traveled extensively in Japan, and maybe they've done the beautiful cities of the so-called Golden Route, so they've spent time in really well-preserved places like Kanazawa and Kyoto. I think it's important to say that much of Japan was really razed to the ground during and then after World War II, as a consequence of World War II, and then also as a consequence of kind of rapid reindustrialization for the Cold War. So regional Japan is not always as physically beautiful as people might be expecting. So Fukuoka does not look like a traditional city. It looks like a really modern skyscraper, bright lights kind of city. It's laid out across two kind of river courses with an island in between, and it's got quite a big population. So people line the riverbanks at night at these well-known yatai, these kind of food stalls where you can, there's maybe 6 stools and you can sit and have a bowl of the famous Hakata ramen or Fukuoka specialty ramen if you really like pork heavy broth. And then move on to the next stall and get some, I don't know, some yakitori or some oyster balls or something. So it's a very modern city in that sense. But then if you look closely within Fukuoka, you find other sites that do tell the historical story. A beautiful Zen temple complex, for example, one of the oldest pagodas at another temple that we visit, one of the oldest pagodas in Japan. And then for me, a really special place just outside Fukuoka is Dazaifu, which was the administrative kind of diplomatic capital for Japan from the 8th century. And of that, almost nothing is left to see. I mean, literally, it's called the old government ruins, and you look at some foundation stones, and that's all. But a site that does encapsulate that history is a shrine, the shrine at Dazaifu, and that's associated with a really much loved bureaucrat and scholar of Japanese history, Michizane Sugawara. And he, in the 9th century, was a great scholar living in Kyoto, but he got on the wrong side of the one of the imperial dynasties, the Fujiwara clan. And they couldn't get rid of him entirely, but they exiled him to Dazaifu. So Fukuoka, Hakata was really seen as the ends of the earth. It had this important bureaucratic place, but it wasn't civilization. And when he is exiled there, his beloved plum tree from Kyoto picks itself up and flies itself to Dazaifu to be close to him, the Tobi Ume, which is still in the grounds of the Dazaifu shrine. So you can still see the plum tree that flew itself to Dazaifu to be with Sugawara in the 9th century, which I love. I think that's incredibly
I think
romantic.
that's one of my favorite stories,
I
and
think
the fact
so.
that he loved plums so much and wrote a fair bit about plums too, didn't
Yeah, and he might not be a family, kind of household name for us,
he?
but in
Yeah.
Japan, he's super important because if you want to do well in an exam, you go to one of the shrines associated with him and you kind of pay reverence to him. They're called Tenmangu shrines, and they're all over Japan. They always have great markets. Tenmangu shrine markets are always really good. And so, yeah, he's this much loved figure, and his flying plum is, even more loved because it's just an irresistible story. But then next to Dazaifu, Kyushu, there's been an acknowledgement, I think, at a central kind of Japanese level that the furthest flung kind of peripheral parts of Japan needed more centralized attention. And so in about the last 10 years, Hokkaido got one of the only national museums. There's a national museum in Tokyo and there's a national museum in Kyoto, but they opened a national museum in Hokkaido that's dedicated to the indigenous Ainu, and they opened a national museum in Kyushu, and that's next to the Dazaifu Shrine Complex, and that's just an extraordinary encyclopedic collection. You don't know what'll be out when you're there, but it kind of doesn't matter because they just have an extraordinary selection of artifacts that are specifically related to the history of Kyushu. So yeah, for me, that's the meat of Fukuoka is the time that we spend at Dazaifu.
Yeah, they do museums so well,
Mm.
Japanese. So we've got our time in Fukuoka, we see Dazaifu, and then we're heading east to the bay that you mentioned, surrounded by volcanoes, and that brings us to some of the natural aspects of Kyushu and the natural world, which the Japanese have a great affinity for the natural world, don't they? And the place that we stay in Oita Prefecture called Beppu.
Yeah, I think something for Australians that's quite helpful when we travel to Japan and tr kind of reflecting on the Japanese relationship with nature and Shinto as a religious tradition, because it's an animistic tradition. It's not about giving you moral rules and precepts and stories. It's more about teaching you how to manage the energy of the natural world around you in its positive, but also its negative manifestations, which is, pretty important when you live in a volcanic country like Japan. One kind of way that Australians, I think, can hook into understanding that is to think about how Indigenous Australians connect to country as well. It's quite a
Mm.
similar way that the Japanese have connected to the natural environment over their history. And in fact, this is like a little factoid that lives rent free in my mind is that outside of Australia, the largest admirers and connoisseurs of Australian art when it comes to exhibition numbers are actually the Japanese. So they do seem to really understand that connection between the cultures. So yeah, Kyushu for a lot of Japanese is a destination, somewhere you would go on holiday for rest and recreation and recharging because of the natural aspects there. So because of mountain forests, for example, but also particularly because of the hot spring culture. So Beppu is nestled under, well, one of many one of many volcanoes, but it kind of sits in the shadow of Mount Surumi. And it has, as a result of that, I mean, quite literally, the streets of Beppu, the vents in the paved streets steam with volcanic steam from the incredibly hot water that's pumping through the drains of the city, that also then, of course, feeds all of the hot springs or onsen that just I've never been to a place that has so many onsen. So yeah, that was definitely something that we wanted to explore on the tour, was that kind of awesome aspect of nature in Kyushu. It is so unpredictable and tied to the volcanoes and to kind of the result of seismic action. But then there's the way in which Japanese people have lived with that and kind of maximized that, from curing skin diseases through hot bathing, but also down to how even the food is cooked
Yes.
in that town.
Yeah, so we do visit a place where you can cook your lunch in the hot spring water, and even for tired feet after walking around all day, there are little footbath places where you can just take your shoes off and have a little rest and soak your feet for a bit.
Yeah, definitely a tour. I mean, we always recommend that people bring the little tenugui, the little kind of
Mm.
hand towels that you can buy really easily in Japan if you don't already have one. And if you don't have one, you should always wait and buy it in Japan because they're much cuter than the ones that we can get here. But yeah, this is definitely a tour where you would need to keep a little towel in your bag for impromptu foot soaking. But even the way they cool because the water that comes out of those springs is, it would burn you if you got straight into it without it being cooled. And even the way they cool the water is so Japanese for me. So they have these big kind of poles covered with the fronds, the dried fronds from bamboo. So not the canes of the bamboo, but the leafy bits. They strip the leaves off them and they cover these kind of, I don't know, framework with the frondy dried sticks and branches of the bamboo, and they pump the hot water up to the top and then trickle it down over those twigs. And with the time it takes to trickle down the twigs, when it gets back into the basin, it's reached a temperature that can be used without scalding people. And so even that, I just think, what a way to cool the water down by using
Mm.
the twigs from the bamboo that they'll use to do all of their amazing traditional crafts that they do with bamboo in the town of Beppu. So yeah, it's that natural connection that the Japanese maintain despite being such a hypermodern and industrialized country. That connection that they maintain to nature is definitely something that we explore in that part of the tour in around Beppu and Oita.
Yeah, and we spend a day up in the forest on the Kunosaki Peninsula and go to a particular temple there called Futagoji. Futago means twins, so two children, and I think that it comes from the guardian demons at the bottom of the stairs, a twin demons guarding it. That just looks particularly beautiful, set in a beautiful forest, peaceful, serene landscape. Yeah,
Indeed.
I wish I was going.
I know you're conveying that.
And then just outside the other way in Oita, so Oita Prefecture, but there's also Oita City, there's so the stone Buddhas that we use, people will have seen in the image for the brochure for the Expo in Kyushu tour. And these are unusual because they're actually made of stone, which most Buddhas carved in temples and throughout Japan are from.
Yeah, so they're from that period in which the capital was established in Heian-kyo. So we call that the Heian period to describe that period when the imperial government centralizes in the city that we call Kyoto today. And that stretches, Heian period is like 8th century to 11th or 12th century. So these stone Buddhas come from that period. There aren't other stone Buddhas from that period. The other ones, as you say, are wood or metal that survive. So these are listed as national treasures because they're so unique. And people listening may know that Japan loves to rank artifacts by their national significance, and national treasure is the highest you can get. You can have a very important cultural property and you can have a national treasure. And we collect, in inverted commas, quite a few national treasures on this tour, but these are carved stone Buddhas that were carved in situ. So I guess you'd call them monolithic. They're carved out of the cave landscape in which we'll still visit them.
Right. And we sort of then traverse cross country. We make a stop for a night in another beautiful scenic region called Takachiho Gorge, where there's a lot of mythology, a lot of there's some princess, Amaterasu Mikami. There's a big mythology legend about her and how she was taunted and teased and got annoyed with her brother. And what did she do? She went and hid.
Yes, and being the sun goddess, she took the light away with her.
Yeah.
There's so many of those stories throughout mythologies of the sun god or goddess, or light god or goddess being, tricked or upset about something and going away and hiding, and therefore light fails and therefore the harvest fails. So yes, we'll get to witness a dance that's been performed for centuries that dramatizes the type of entertainments that the other gods did to try and tempt her back out of her cave, out of her sulk, to bring the light back with her again. So, and that's it's kind of deeply mystical, shamanistic type tradition that I don't think people really usually get a sense of when they visit Japan. I think when people think about Japan, they think about order, but there's also a kind of a deep chaos at the heart of Shinto that says, well, it's pretty hard to deal with the natural world and its unpredictability, and you can try and push it and pull it and shape it to your needs, but at its essence, it remains something chaotic, and you need to do everything you can to placate it. So this dance was like a kind of desperate last ditch attempt to bring her out of her cave. It worked. It brought her, it did bring her out of the cave.
And the light came back.
The light came back, as we know. So yeah, I think that'll be an interesting, the only other place, so you and I've talked about this, the only other place that I think you can kind of touch that wild heart of Japanese religious tradition would be somewhere like Izumo, at a big shrine there, also associated with Amaterasu. And then and there's another very significant shrine associated with her as well. So she does seem to be the chaotic force at the heart of the Japanese pantheon.
Yeah.
So that'll be fun, I think.
Yeah, and people will have seen her statues if they've been to the National Museum in Tokyo as well. There's that whole pavilion with just the most amazing array of Buddhas and statues in there. That's just superb.
Yeah.
But I digress.
It's easy to do.
we should then keep moving on through the tour, and we're going next to Kumamoto, which we sort of see there how the West came to see Japan, particularly during the Meiji era. Big castle there.
Yeah, people probably know that from the early 17th century to the middle of the 19th century, Japan embarked on this kind of political policy of self-sufficiency, which was called Sakoku, or closed country politics. And that's what makes Nagasaki so interesting, as I'm sure we'll talk about when we get to Nagasaki, because it was the only kind of outlet to the rest of the world during that 250-year period. And then when Japan did open up again to the outside world in the so-called Meiji period, known for the name of the emperor, it's the imperial name of that period is the Meiji period. When it did then reopen to the rest of the world, first of all, the rest of the world kind of was staggered by Japan, and Japan was staggered by the rest of the world. But Japan had an influx of knowledge about the West, but someone also had to help take information about Japan from the East. And Lafcadio Hearn is this very unusual figure of the 19th century who was born in Greece but lived in Dublin and America and Martinique, and ended up in Japan, married a Japanese woman, had 4 children, took on a Japanese name, was granted Japanese citizenship, which was, unheard of. Yeah. So he's right, kind of an absolute representative of that Meiji period. And he was a teacher in Japan. And so he translated for the West a lot of those, precisely those stories we were just discussing, like the story of Amaterasu or Japanese ghost stories, if people remember that amazing exhibition at the art gallery in Sydney a few years ago about Japanese mythological and spooky tales. He translated a lot of those in early collections. So he is kind of one of the first people to say to the rest of the world, this is what Japan is like, this is what it's about. And he was able to do that from a really privileged position because he did become bilingual. And he lived in various places. Interestingly enough, one of them was near that shrine we just spoke about, Izumo. And then he lived in Kumamoto as well. So we'll visit his house when we're in Kumamoto. But really for us, for our tour, Kumamoto is a kind of a functional way to get to the Amakusa Islands, which are really otherwise quite hard to get to. You definitely couldn't do them as a day trip kind of thing. I did them like that myself some years ago, and it was most ill-advised. So instead of trying to come and go from them in one day, instead we're traveling to Nagasaki via the islands. I'm sure it'll still be a long day because the distances, getting around islands is never a smooth thing except in Japan, because transport in Japan is always so smooth, as people know. But although I'm sure it'll still be a long day, it's a day that's really rich in ideas because it's in the Amakusa Islands that the so-called most of the so-called hidden Christian sites are located. This is a UNESCO listing. It's UNESCO that calls them that. One of the more recent UNESCO listings for Japan, there's always been a lot of debate about is UNESCO in its listings too focused on European sites. So this was a 2018 listing for Japan, and it's a group listing of places associated with the so-called hidden Christians. So people who converted to Christianity in a really small window, from basically the end of the 15th century to the end of the 16th century. There's like a 100-year window when Jesuit missionaries, particularly from Portugal, were able to come to Japan, thanks to a particular policy of the shoguns of the time, the different shoguns of that period. They were mostly coming with Portuguese traders who were there to trade guns, and the Japanese needed the guns to fight this endless war between rival pretenders to the title of shogun. And so the missionaries kind of came along for the ride and managed to convert quite a few people, particularly in the south, particularly in the island of Kyushu, because that was their port. That was where they were trading in the weapons. And so there was this move to convert, and people did convert. And then in the early 16th century, I always get my centuries wrong, early 17th century, the shoguns decided that there was too great a risk of sedition, that Christians would owe allegiance to God before they'd owe it to the shogun. And so they outlaw Christianity, and they not only outlaw Christianity, but they shut down the ports to everyone but the Dutch, who are Protestants and a little less concerned to convert and a little more concerned to make money, as you said, being from the Dutch Republic, and the Chinese, who are not there to peddle. They've already peddled their great gift of religion, Buddhism, many years earlier. So, yeah, the sites associated with the Christians who then go underground, because there's a period in which there are forced conversions, and there's some very convincing reasons to convert, which can include, escaping death, basically. So a lot of people convert, but some Christians go underground, despite all of the processes the government executes to force conversions away, deconversions, if that's a word, from Christianity. But those who go underground then maintain their Christian practices and beliefs with no external influence and no external guidance for the next 250 years. So when Christians do come back to the south of Japan, to the island of Kyushu in the Meiji period, so in the middle of the 19th century, the Christianity they find, the kind of mass that is being said by those people who are converted by Portuguese Jesuits, the words that they use to describe their Christianity that they translated from Portuguese in the 16th century, they've preserved those into the modern era. So the hidden Christians are really quite fascinating, and there's a concentration of their sites in Amakusa, but also in Nagasaki. So that's why we go through the Amakusa Islands.
Yeah, and we visit the particular museum, the 26 Martyrs Museum, in Nagasaki, of exactly persecuted Christians that were killed, I think crucified on the
Yeah,
ended up being martyred, and they've been visited there by the Pope, two popes, I believe, John Paul II and I think it was a Leo, but correct me if I'm wrong, or if you remember.
I get my popes very muddled.
I've been to the museum, but I always find it fascinating that we have one saint in Australia and they have 26. They're ostensibly not really a Christian country, but that's
quite, that is great, isn't it?
I find those sort of factoids amusing.
Yeah, I do too. And I find the idea just extraordinary that they persist, and the manifestations of their Christianity. And there's this whole culture, even a visual culture, designed to turn people away from Christianity. So you get these extraordinary little icons in metal or painted on panel of Christian imagery, and people are asked to step on those in front of the entire village to show that they have no respect for Mary, they have no respect for Jesus. They'll step on their image in front of everyone. These kind of stepping images, they were called stepping on images, and there's whole collections of those that survive in various places, in Japanese collections of these worn away metal images that have been, because you had to renew the abjuration every year. Every year, there would be the ceremony in the village where you had to step on the thing to show that you weren't a Christian. So they get worn away over time. And then you also have these, statues of supposedly Japanese gods and goddesses, but it's actually Mary and Jesus in disguise. And it's the way the Christians could continue to venerate the Christian figures without, raising any alarm bells, because the figures look Japanese, rather than Palestinian. So yeah, it's a fascinating moment in Japan's history, I think, the moment of the hidden Christians.
And another important feature of Nagasaki, I suppose, is the World War II aspect to it, with the bombing, the atomic bomb that helped bring about the end of World War II. And there's a big peace museum there, and the bombing museum that we do go and visit. I think I was mentioning to you earlier today when we were talking about this, about how Nagasaki actually wasn't the target that day. It was another city in the north called Kokura that was an industrial city where all the weapons and things were. But it was too foggy, and the vision, they couldn't see very well from the bomber, so they just kept going and bombed Nagasaki because they had to drop the bomb because it was too heavy.
Yeah. With other groups, we've visited Hiroshima and the Peace Park and the museum in Hiroshima, and it's always quite a sobering visit. It's a lot of the imagery can be quite confronting, and also the groups that I've been with struggle a little with the presentation of the information in those museums in Japan as well. And perhaps this is something that will change with generational renewal, but that there's not necessarily an objective assessment of everything that was in play that led to those events, that there's a focus on obviously the suffering that the bomb created for people in Nagasaki and Hiroshima in particular, but less of a discussion about why the decision making that led to the dropping of the bombs and what the bombs actually achieved then in terms of ending the Pacific War, as you say. So yeah, it's a sobering thing. And I remember that you and I definitely discussed whether or not to include it on the tour, or whether to leave people with an afternoon to go and visit the museum themselves. But then you find that a majority of people do go, and so you may as well, have a coach for them to get there. So we always tell people that they can opt out of any part of the activities at any time on any of our tours, so no one's obliged to visit it. But I think it is an important part of the story, and it's quite a fascinating link as well to Nagasaki's earlier history, because it does become, in that period of closed country politics, it's really the only port by which the Dutch and the Chinese can engage with Japan for about 250 years. And so Nagasaki itself as a city becomes this very interesting. You see the Japanese taking small little snippets here and there from the west through Dejima, the island, the kind of artificial island on which the Dutch traders were. It was a gated community for them. A bit like the ghetto in Venice in that sense. So you see the Japanese getting small little snippets of an idea of what's happening in the West from Dejima. And of course, what's happening in the West in that period is the Enlightenment. So in terms of natural sciences, and medicine, it's a pretty key period. But then you also see this kind of wholesale export of Japanese material culture from Nagasaki, particularly in the form of pottery. So Nagasaki is also, like Fukuoka, a gateway place, and so even though it wasn't the intended target, it's quite interesting to think in how it's a bit of a negative gateway in that sense as well in the 20th century.
Yeah, and the architecture on Dejima is it's European.
Yeah.
It's quite different. So you live this Japanese city, you've got European architecture on this island in this one enclosed space, and then you go to some of the temples and they're distinctly Chinese.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Nagasaki has a Chinatown, doesn't it? And as you say, it actually feels like a Chinatown. It doesn't feel like some kind of fake recreation of a Chinatown because, yeah, the Chinese merchants who lived in Nagasaki built temples in a Chinese style, not a Japanese Chinese style, which also exists, but an
Mm.
actual Japanese Chinese style rather. And then, yeah, as you say, the buildings on Dejima are like European warehouses and yeah, it's quite I really like Nagasaki, that sense
Yeah.
of diversity that you get in Nagasaki, which is um there are other Japanese cities like Osaka where you feel that sense of cultural diversity, but I think you particularly feel it in Nagasaki. I like that. I
Yeah,
like
and
that
then
aspect.
you've got the Christian Catholic cathedral. So you've got a
Yeah.
cathedral, and then next door is Scottish trading merchants' garden, Glover Gardens.
Yeah.
It's just quite a interesting place with all the different
Yeah.
aspects to it. It's
Yeah, very different. Yeah.
yeah, just always fascinates me how different regions in Japan really do have their own individual distinct feel and attitude to them.
Yeah.
Um, I think something that you like to talk about, you mentioned your recent visit. We're going up to Saga Prefecture, which is a pottery area.
Kathleen talks about ceramics.
Right.
I do like to talk about ceramics. I do like to look at ceramics. I do like to enjoy, appreciate, and admire ceramics. Yeah, I mean, people who have traveled in Japan will know that the material culture of Japan is incredibly sophisticated, incredibly regional. You know, part of the thinking behind the closed country politics of the 17th century was to protect Japan. The shogunal government saw how Asia rather was being colonized by European powers. And so they figured that by closing their borders entirely, they could prevent colonization. And you have to say, well, along with Thailand, that worked. They are one of the only Asian countries not to have been colonized by Europe. And it is partly as a result of that culture. But at the same time, one of the benefits, there are difficulties for a nation that opts for autarky. But one of the benefits of doing that is that your material culture really only has to speak to you, to your needs and your tastes. It doesn't have to travel because you don't really intend for it to travel. And so the kind of heyday of Japanese arts and crafts is that period of the Edo, so-called Edo period that corresponds to the closed country system. And Kyushu really comes to the fore in that period for ceramics. So right at the kind of beginning of the closed country period, one of the shoguns decides, Hideyoshi decides that he's going to conquer Korea and he launches a couple of failed invasions, and at the end of one of them he dies actually as part of this, and at the end of it his troops look around and they think, well, we won't get paid. What are we going to do? What can we take back to Japan to stand in lieu of payment? And they take people. They enslave Korean potters and take them back to Kyushu and say, set up a local pottery industry for us, please. And the Korean potters in the early 17th century look around the quite literally the landscape of the town they've been taken to, which is Arita. And they say, well, this was once volcanic. The stone here was heated to an extraordinarily high temperature and it was bleached of all of its color. And it's actually porcelain stone. And so they start a porcelain, not just pottery, but a porcelain industry in Kyushu. And this is exactly then the pottery that is, I mean, it looks when you go to big museums in Europe or whatever, it looks like every single thing that was made in Japan was being exported by the Dutch East India Company to Europe. But in fact, most of the production is kept for local use. And you have an entire mountain village of 12 families that only make pottery for the shogun and his ambassadors to give as gifts. But there's a limited quantity that is then exported from Japan by the Dutch and also by the Chinese to some extent through Arita's port, which is a town called Imari, which is the other name given to this kind of highly decorated porcelain style that comes out of Kyushu. So you've got that tradition that's based in the prefecture called Saga that we showed on the map. But within that same kind of modern political region or prefecture today, there's another town called Karatsu that's the flip side of that. So Imari ware or Arita ware is very highly decorated porcelain with gold detailing. It's extremely luxurious as an object. But at the same time, there was an equal passion that arose out of tea ceremony in Japan for more rustic or wabi-sabi pottery as well. And so a town called Karatsu in Kyushu, in that area of Saga that we showed on the map, it produces a much more rustic, earthy kind of style that's equally popular but doesn't get exported. You know, the European taste is for the flashy stuff. And the more wabi-sabi production is kept quite local. So again, I think that's quite interesting in Kyushu that you've got that part of the local industry and economy that's very outside looking, thinking what that we make will appeal to a foreign market and how can we capitalize on that. So they make things like, you know, shaving bowls and objects that they don't have any use for in Japan, but they make them just for the export market. But then on the other hand, there's the part of the market that's just responding to local national tastes and can do that because it doesn't have to fulfill a massive export economy. That's not how the economy is working in the closed country politics, period. So yeah, I love that craft aspect of Kyushu just from a, you know, personal perspective because I love pottery. I love looking at it, and it's very beautiful and very sophisticated. But I also love how it tells part of that story of Kyushu's very different history. It's very different history to the rest of Japan.
Yeah, I've seen some of the white porcelain, and it's just exquisite, the craftsmanship in it, like crafted dragons, but with the whiskers and everything attached. It's just amazing, and they're
Yeah.
just so skilled to the point where someone you saw on your recent trip actually still crafts porcelain for the emperor.
Yeah, yeah. Talking to him was amazing. Hiroki-san, his family was chosen in the 17th century to supply porcelain exclusively to the imperial family, and they still do. And he will be called by the, I guess, you know, major domo of the imperial household, who'll say, of the set that your 12th time grandfather made for us in 1672, we've got one bowl and one cup that are broken, and we need you to replace those. So he has to make them exactly to order as his 12 times grandfather made them for the emperor in the 17th century. He has to, of course, calculate for the loss, which is about 20% with pottery. So he's got to make more than is ordered in case there's loss. And then he wraps each piece himself and drives them personally up to Tokyo, where he's stopped at the gates to the imperial palace, and the major domo comes out and unwraps every single piece to check not just that they haven't broken in transit, but to check that each piece is without flaw, and then they become part of the Imperial collection. He also makes new services for the Imperial collection as well. And he also makes his own work, which is nothing, nothing like that historic porcelain. It's much closer to the work of an English ceramicist, Edmund de Waal, who people might know from The Hair with the Amber Eyes. So yeah, it was fascinating to think that there's some poor person sitting somewhere who has to make something exactly the same. If you've ever broken like a lid of a pottery dish and you've tried to get the same lid made for you, you'll know it's almost impossible to make the exact same dimensions again. It's very, very hard with shrinkage and loss. And here he is sitting there in Arita. And that's what his family has always done, and that's what he does as well. So yeah, the generational transmission of all of that arts and craft knowledge and technique is quite staggering. Even if you don't like pottery, if you don't like pottery, I don't understand you. But even if you don't like pottery, the transmission of the craft is amazing.
So not just some kintsugi there and a bit of gold to sort of mend it together. It's not good enough for the emperor.
No, no, I mean, although, don't get me distracted, Mark-san, but
Sorry.
you know that in one of the things that was amazing in the National Ceramics Museum, which we'll visit in Arita on the tour, is really early examples of kintsugi where there is some extraordinary dish that has chipped and it has been repaired, you know, back in the 17th century. I think one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in the National Museum in Tokyo was a Yayoi era pottery vessel that was maybe from between the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century AD. And some tea ceremony master had found it in the 16th century and had it repaired with kintsugi so he could use it as his hot water vessel. So yeah, the again, that kind of continuity is so amazing. And there are those early sites in Kyushu as well. So we
Yeah.
do kind of conclude the tour. You're probably looking to wrap me up, but we do kind of conclude the tour with a visit to a site called Yoshinogari, which is kind of between Fukuoka and Saga on that map we showed to begin with. And that is one of the most extensive archaeological sites in Japan. Or actually, it is the most extensive archaeological site in Japan for the so-called Yayoi period. Yayoi, like Yayoi Kusama, pronounced
Mhm.
the same way, named after a suburb in Tokyo, actually, where they made the first significant find from this period. And there'd always been a lot of debate and discussion about how people came to the Japanese archipelago. And the story of Shinto is that it is indigenous. It's very similar to kind of the stories about country in Australia and the dreaming. So, like the sun goddess Amaterasu, for example, she and her brother, who you might remember she hid from in the cave when she was cranky, they do end up making children together. And those children helped to create the Japanese archipelago. So there was this story about how Japan had come into being and how people had arrived there. But it's not until the 19th century and the Meiji period that there's a systematic investigation of the history and the archaeology of it. So the Yayoi period is from about the 3rd century BC to about the 3rd century AD. It's distinguished from the periods before and after it by its pottery. Pottery is usually how archaeological periods are distinguished in Japan in particular. And it's a period that seems to correspond to heavy migration through Kyushu from the mainland, from Korea. Um, Not by land bridge at that point in time, but by boat. And so it seems to be a different group of people arriving in Japan who bring with them different pottery, wet rice farming, which is how people in Japan stop being nomadic because they can stay in one place and feed a bigger community because they can store rice in greater quantities. It's when the imperial system first seems to emerge in terms of kind of an aristocratic hierarchy. And a lot of that has been recreated because, of course, this is prehistory for Japan. We don't have a writing system in Japan until the 6th century, so it's prehistoric in that sense. But the archaeology is how a lot of this can be identified, and Yoshinogari is the first big
Mm.
kind of, it's a really big site, and still not, there's this real difficulty in excavating prehistoric sites in Japan because they're identified with the imperial history, and a lot of them are owned by the imperial household who won't allow excavation. But this site has been excavated quite extensively. So yeah, we almost finished the tour there really before heading back to Fukuoka where we started it. So yeah, it's great. I think that we get that. Japanese are very, very interested in those prehistoric people, the Jomon and the Yayoi, because they see them as kind of archetypes of things that are still important to them
Mm.
in terms of their national identity today. So yeah, it's great that we can conclude the tour with that part of the story.
Yeah, so we end at the beginning, really.
We do. In that sense, yes, we do.
I mean, that's just what makes Fukuoka so, Fukuoka, but Kyushu so different in all these different aspects that we
Yeah.
go through to it. And it's, we're on the go a bit with the tour, but we do have the stops, 3 nights where possible, like Kingaku and Nagasaki. But we've rated the tour as challenging.
Yeah.
You got any sort of advice for people who might be coming along?
Yeah, I think it is. We've rated it as challenging, which is our highest physical fitness rating. And we did that less for the actual physical challenges of the tour, although certainly there would be occasions where people would need to remove shoes, and there would be a few occasions where people might need to sit on the tatami. We tend to schedule things, particularly meals, so that that's not a necessity. But there are inevitably on each tour outside of main cities in Japan, inevitably there's an occasion where people do need to sit on the floor. So I think that's, and we've got a couple of, you know, flights of stairs without handrails to visit the mountain temple. So there's some kind of physical challenges in that aspect, but we rated it as challenging more because it off the beaten track is a really overused expression, but it is in terms of international tourism to Japan. Kyushu is new. It's been like a hidden secret for the Japanese, and international tourism is only just discovering it. And when you are the avant-garde, it's not always comfortable. So we rate it as challenging, I think, because we really would encourage people to have an open cultural mindset on the tour. So if you are comfortable taking a kid off with other people of your sex, then you can really enjoy a full range of hot spring experiences, which are fabulous for your skin, fabulous for your joints. You have the best night's sleep you'll ever have after a hot spring, but it does require you to kind of get past that cultural barrier of we don't usually all sit around with our clothes off, at least in our culture. So I think that's why we rated it as challenging, because of those cultural interfaces on the tour at meals with the hot springs, which we would really encourage people to take advantage of. And I should say, people can book private baths in the hotels that we stay at, so you don't have to take your kid off in front of everyone. But if you do have more of an insight into how the culture works. So yeah, I think it was mostly just encouraging people to keep an open mind, as well as, yeah, sometimes good knees are required.
Yeah, it's ritual. The bathing is a ritualistic thing as well, isn't it? Just the whole cleansing before you go in, and then just being in the water, being able to relax without having to think of anything else.
Exactly.
Quick little towel on your head.
Yeah.
So cool.
And perspire like you've never perspired before.
Need a shower afterwards as well. Well, I think we've covered nearly everything, unless you've got anything else you wanted to wrap up with.
No, you don't want to you don't want to give me more time, I'll take it.
Yeah, well, we've basically killed our time now, so I'll take the opportunity just to thank everyone this afternoon for joining us. And the lecture is also, or the talk is also going to be available online. Will be sent out to anyone who's registered. And I know you're looking forward to the tour in November, and it should be a great survey of a wonderful island and on a wonderful set of islands.
Yeah, no, Rel's looking forward to her tour in October as well. People may not know this about her, but Rel also makes pottery in addition to being a specialist on Japanese language and history. She's also a potter in her spare time, so I'm sure she's looking forward to going to the pottery destination of Japan as well. So yeah, it'd be great to see some people in Japan later this year.
And of course, it's a great time of year. It's not too hot. It's not too cold yet. So being in the south, so
autumn, my favorite time.
Autumn, yeah,
hot springs and foliage and
the peninsula, those temples, etc.
Mushrooms and chestnuts, all the reasons that you'll start to get jealous. Exactly.
And the ramen. Well, once again, thanks for talking to us today, Kathleen. As always, it's been great, enlightening, illuminating, and fun. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
enjoy
Mark.
the tour.
Thank you, and thanks for your help designing it.
No problem. Anytime.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everybody.